My name is David Harvey. I'm director of the Center for Place, Culture and Politics here at the CUNY Graduate Center. And we are very pleased to host this event and sponsor this event this evening. The center exists to confront political questions, and we do a great deal of public programming, and this is part of that activity. And we also try to work with social movements, Right to the City, Excluded Workers' Congress. And we have a conference coming up on the 12th and 13th of May, jointly with Socialist Register, to look at socialist strategies in relationship to precarious labor. The co-sponsors of this are our very good friends at the Brecht Forum here in New York City, which is one of the most fabulous open spaces for progressive political discussion and argument. If you're not familiar with them, go on their website. Fantastic programming, and it's always a tremendous pleasure for us and a privilege to actually co-sponsor events with them. This evening we're going to deal with the question of the rights of nature. There is a little book which is about the case for a universal declaration of the rights of Mother Earth. And it so happens that 2 years ago, April 22nd, which is tomorrow, was declared as the day for celebration of the international rights of Mother Earth. So it's a very appropriate moment in which to hold this panel. And we have here a group of people who were very much involved in the Cochabamba Declaration, which is the rights of nature, and it's very, let's say, very pleasurable to have this group of people here. On my immediate left is Shannon Biggs, who directs the Community Rights Program at Global Exchange, and her work is aimed at placing the legal rights of nature and citizens above those of corporate interests. Cormac Cullinan is the author of the seminal book on the rights of nature, Wild Law, which you can purchase outside. If you do purchase it outside, you can have a copy of the rights to nature free. If you've already got a copy of it, already purchased it, you can get this for $5. Next is Vandana Shiva, an Indian philosopher, physicist, environmental activist, and eco-feminist. Vandana has authored many books, has fought many battles over genetically modified foods and the like. And she's very well known as an activist, and we welcome her back here. She came to the center, I've forgotten how many years ago now, 6 or 7 years ago, so it's a pleasure to welcome her back. And then there is, beyond that, Maude Barlow, who's the National Chairperson of the Council of Canadians, Chair of the Board of Food and Water Watch, and also a very eminent environmentalist. And last but not least is Pablo Solon, a long-time social activist and currently ambassador to the plurinational state of Bolivia, to the United Nations. And as UN ambassador, Solon has spearheaded many of these resolutions and on questions of rights to water, rights to nature. And he was one of the key organizers of the World People's Conference on Climate Change in Cochabamba, Bolivia, in April 2010. The way I thought it would be good to organize this was maybe to ask each of the panelists to take 5 minutes to talk a little bit about the question of what do we mean by the rights to nature, why is it so significant? And then we'll have a little discussion between us all, maybe for the first hour, and then we will throw it open to the audience. So with that, perhaps I should turn this over now to Shannon Biggs. Shannon.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you for having us. I'm going to take a little less than 5 minutes because we have a lot of people up here to talk about this large question, which is, what do we mean when we talk about the rights of nature? And nature is, generally speaking, it's a system governing our well-being. Yet, in our culture, we operate as if nature is human property. And in fact, in our laws, in our legal system, nature is understood to be human property, like a slave. So when we talk about what does it mean to recognize rights for nature, I think a good place to start is also just looking at some of the questions that as we're looking at Earth Day, and yesterday, of course, is the anniversary of the BP oil spill. A question might be to say, what would be different? What would have been different in that case if Mother Nature had rights? If we, in our culture, treated nature as if we were one species among many, and had a relationship with nature that included us as part of this larger system. But yet in our culture, as I said, we treat it very differently. How do we get from the place where we are now, which is saying that if nature is property, and with property we know you can do whatever you want with a piece of property, you can destroy it at will. So if we're talking about rights for nature, we're not talking about giving rights to individual bugs or trees. We're talking about the vitality of ecosystems and the protection of the vitality of ecosystems. And what if, for example, nature had rights, and rights also means that you can be seen in the eyes of the law as an entity able to stand up and defend and protect your rights. What would be different today if instead of looking at a BP oil spill, the only people who can sue BP are those with a financial claim, a property claim? What would be different if nature itself, the ecosystem, could go into a court of law and sue BP for full restoration, to be made whole again? Because as it stands now, of course, we know there are thousands of miles of oil and dispersants lying below the surface, and everywhere that goes, the destruction of habitat ensues. So I put out the question in that way, in terms of what do we mean when we talk about nature's rights, and what would look different. I think it would look very different if BP really had to be responsible for the damage that they had caused. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Cormac Cullinan.
Thanks, Shannon. I guess I first came to this work partially from a practical angle, in the sense that I was encountering difficulties when I was trying to draft legislation, which I couldn't fix by changing the wording, and I began to realize that there was something more fundamentally wrong, that there was something wrong with the underlying philosophies of law, jurisprudence. And sometime after that, I was fortunate enough to be introduced to the work of Thomas Berry, and subsequently met and worked with Thomas. And he really, I think, gave me the missing part of the jigsaw puzzle by pointing out that our legal systems as a whole effectively legitimize and facilitate the exploitation of Earth. And the first time I heard that, I was really shocked, because I've practiced for a long time as an environmental lawyer, and I thought I was one of the good guys. And to sort of hear that he was saying that effectively that our governance systems are part of the problem was quite a shock. But the more I looked at it, the more convinced I became that he was right. But I guess the way I see these things is that what we call environmental law, and although I'm an environmental law practitioner, really isn't working. I mean, in the last couple of decades, maybe 3 decades, you've seen an unprecedented increase in the volume of international legal instruments dealing with the environment, national laws, etc. But if you look at the results, the quality of Earth is deteriorating everywhere. And I think part of the reason for that is that we have become effectively autistic in relation to the natural world. We've forgotten that we're part of a system, and we've forgotten that if you're part of a system, you've got to play by the rules of the system, and that we ought to align our legal systems with the natural order. If you go to law school, you're taught that all you need to know is in the law library. It's the cases, it's the legislation, and it's the work, the writings of some legal theorists on those. The idea that there's a system of order out there, nature, that you have to comply with is just not even considered. So really I came to this through trying to find ways of, practical ways of dealing with the problems that we face. And because I was brought up in apartheid South Africa, I've never had a glorified idea of the law. It's been very clear to me in the beginning, from the beginning, that the law is an instrument of those in power, and it's shaped by social forces to achieve particular ends. But what we can see here is that, as Shannon says, our legal systems have entrenched an exploitative relationship between humans and the environment or nature, or Mother Earth. And so we shouldn't be surprised if we get ongoing exploitation and degradation of the earth. And I think that just in the way that we've recognized that certain relationships between human beings are so fundamental and so important that we want to use the machinery of the state to enforce them. And so we've called those relationships, we've defined them in terms of rights, so that you can use the law to enforce those rights. What we've missed is that there are equally fundamental relationships between humans and every other aspect of our habitat. And unless we also call those rights, we can't use the mechanisms of the state to effectively balance human interests against the interests of the other parts of the system. So there's the whole system is inherently biased against nature. And so I guess I come to the idea of rights of nature from a pragmatic point of view, that if we want to re-establish ecological balances, then we need to change our governance systems by expanding the class of rights holders so that we can balance the interests of humans not only against other humans but also against the interests of other members of what one could call the Earth community. Thank you.
About 40 years ago, I got involved with an amazing movement in my region. It was called Chipko, which means to hug. And it was the original tea huggers, where women came out to say, we will hug the trees, and you can't kill the tree till you kill us. And the movement was successful, and by 1981, we got a logging ban. But the most important thing was, every time I would go as a volunteer, the women would talk about the forests as their mothers, and talk about the rights of the forest, and their rights as derived rights. I learned very clearly how for the majority of people in India, and I think majority of people in the South, and I would imagine the majority of young people across the world, the idea that nature has rights is not strange. The idea that nature does not have rights is the strange thinking. For me, this got aggravated when, I grew up, did all my environmental activism with the fundamental recognition of the intrinsic worth of all species. And then we come across patenting of seed and the intellectual property rights agreements of the WTO, and that's what forced me to start Navdanya, to basically defend a way of thinking and living with other species without reducing them to the property of corporations. And the idea that the reason seeds and plants can be treated as properties because they're inventions of Monsanto, when all that Monsanto does is put toxics into them, and they shouldn't be rewarded with a monopoly, they should be punished for contamination. So of course I got deeply involved because of all of this into the TRIPS agreement, the WTO, and that's how many of us came together into the International Forum on Globalization. And And over the years, I've realized that what's basically happened is, for most cultures and through most history, we've seen ourselves as part of the Earth community. Humans are one element of the Earth community. We are one strand in it. And then the scientific revolution, industrial revolution created a worldview where nature didn't count, she was dead matter, the Earth was not living, and it was only about humans, and that's how the anthropomorphic idea grew. But what corporate globalization has done is mutate this even further from anthropomorphism to corporatism. And now the only legal personality is not trees, not rivers, not fish, not humans, not ordinary citizens, but fictitious corporations. And that's the crisis we are in. And that's the crisis we have to address by a balancing of rights and a balancing of the recognition of the rights of nature on whose support we exist. Now, my work in ecological movements in India makes it very, very clear that nature's rights are not opposite to human rights. Human rights are a subset of nature's rights because we are part of nature. We've just stopped last year a bauxite mining in this amazing mountain called Niyamgiri, which means the mountain that upholds the sacred law. And the argument of the tribals was simply this mountain upholds the sacred law. You destroy it, you destroy our universe. And therefore you can't take the bauxite. Leave the bauxite in the mountain. 1983, I was very fortunate to have been asked by the Ministry of Environment to do a study on mining in Doon Valley, which is my hometown. And our study led to a Supreme Court case, amazing order, because we showed that mining limestone led to the destruction of water, and the aquifer was what was really the value. And the courts ruled that the mining had to stop because life has to carry on. And it's an amazing judgment. Go and look at it. It's called the Doon Valley Judgment in Dehradun in the Supreme Court of India in 1983. And right now we are fighting a huge movement against 300 dams being built on the Ganges. And there are only two words we use in the whole movement. Allow the Ganges to flow nirmal, which is clean, and aviral, which is without interruption. That she has the first right to flow. And we can only derive our use of the river while respecting that first right. I think what we are at is at a very historic moment. It's a historic moment because at a time we are seeing destruction on a scale you can't imagine, we're also seeing the emergence of a unifying thinking, a thinking that brings together all the diverse movements, where the ground of the movements is very simply that all species on this planet have rights, and each of us very ordinary human beings also have rights. This morning or yesterday at the UN, Cormac reminded us that apartheid means separateness. And at least I'm of the generation which joined anti-apartheid movements wherever we were. Our passports used to have, we can't enter South Africa. And today, of course, we can because apartheid was put aside. But apartheid means separateness. And I think the big apartheid we have to overcome is our separation from nature. A forced separation against our will, just because it's so convenient to appropriate, manipulate, exploit, own nature's diverse gifts, if we separate ourselves from nature. And it's not that all of humanity is then turning nature into property. People, ordinary people, are losing their water, their land. The land grab of Africa, the land grab in India is huge. So the disconnection from nature is the big disease, and I really treat it like a psychological disease. Obviously, if your reality is you're connected and you pretend you're not, that's hallucination. And so the real thing we have to do is build the Earth democracy that we are part of. And this becomes vital because without this, we cannot reclaim democracy. The corporations have such a stranglehold on our societies now that if we don't enlarge our minds, even for humans, there will not be freedom. We need nature to rescue us from the new corporate dictatorship.
Oh, thank you very much for being here tonight. It's wonderful to see this full room. I want to start off with a tiny story that to me encapsulates what we're talking about here. Saw a report the other day from somebody who was an authority saying, don't worry about the effect of radiation from the spill in Japan on humans. Sorry, we'll just take a break here and get some water. Great, thank you. Thank you so much. Because by the time it gets to the fish that humans eat, it will be so dispersed it won't matter. And I thought that's the heart of what we're about here, is saying, well, why didn't it matter that it's entered the ocean? If you want to read a good book by a Canadian author, Alana Mitchell, it's called Seasick, and it's the oceans are in terrible trouble. It's not just what we see in our immediate surroundings. It's not just climate crisis, and it's not just water, which is the thing I work on most, but just this notion that out of sight, out of mind, and as long as it doesn't hurt us when we sit down to our steamed fish, then it's fine. Modern humans, and very clearly, obviously not indigenous or tribal peoples, but modern humans tend to see nature as a resource for our convenience and our profit and our pleasure. And so we have done great damage thinking that we had an abundance that could never be ended. And as a result, we have the climate crisis, we have the crisis of the oceans, we have the crisis of water. There's a new study that says that by 2030, the demand for water in our world is going to outstrip supply by about 40%, which is an absolutely astounding statistic, and denotes terrible suffering now and in the future. And of course, we're in one of the great waves of species extinction. And I think the point that we're all making is that we include humans in that, and that an assault on Mother Earth is an assault on humans and having a terrible, devastating impact on the poor, particularly, and indigenous peoples. So our system is not working. But all of our governments, just about, with the odd exception, Bolivia being one of them, are still out there, no matter what words they use around caring about the environment. They're still out there promoting all the policies that are so destructive. Unlimited growth, free trade agreements, unregulated investment agreements, removing nation-state regulation in order to promote the rights of corporations. And no matter what they say with their words, their actions go in the other direction. And of course, the environmental movement then is left to try to negotiate with governments and corporations for the least damage. So it's a negotiation to stop so much pollution, or to reduce the threat in a particular area, or to negotiate lower levels of greenhouse gas emissions and so on. But it's coming at it in such a compromising way, and we always come away knowing that we've been compromised, and at the end, the Earth is losing. And even the so-called green economy, and I know there are many definitions that could be very, very exciting of a green economy, the way our elites, our governments, our business people around the world are looking at it is basically it's a market solution to the crisis, and the idea is you just replace bad technology with better technology, and you don't have to challenge anything, the growth imperative, the money that we earn, and so on. One of the latest concerns that a lot of us have is this PES, payment for environmental or payment for ecological services, which is actually being negotiated or being analyzed by the United Nations Environment Program, and they've actually put a price on nature. They say they figure it's worth about $72 trillion, and the idea is the only way that you can save nature is to bring it into the market economy, and it will have to compete against other forces in order to survive. I remember Mugabe saying that if wild animals in his country can't survive by making money, they're not going to survive at all. So the hunting and whatever is how they survive. So the rights of nature, the rights of Mother Earth, seeks to shift this paradigm so that we look at and understand that water will be here, that biodiversity will be here, that forests will be here, and so on forever, instead for all generations and for other species, instead of being used up entirely by ours. And our whole mindset, of course, is based on human-centered law. So our question is, what would it be like if we shifted our focus to give the earth and other species the right to exist? I did an interview today, and somebody said, well, does that mean every insect has the right, the same rights as humans? And I said, no, but it does mean you can't drive that insect species to extinction. We really need to understand what we're doing to ourselves as well when we behave like that. If we believe that rights are inherent, existent by virtue of our creation, then surely nature, and not just humans, all other nature and all other species have rights as well. And I just want to say that it is our dream and our hope, and in here what you'll see with the rights of nature, and this is the launch tonight, is out brand new, the case for Universal Declaration on the Rights of Mother Earth. This came from a wonderful meeting that was called after the failure of the COP15 in Copenhagen, which the corporations called Hopenhagen, and because Coca-Cola was everywhere with their little elves giving you Coke and talking about how they brought you the UN summit, I started calling Copenhagen. After the failure of Copenhagen, the Bolivian government called us together, and something like 35,000 of us came from around the world, and out of that came this movement for the right, for the Universal Declaration on the right of Mother Earth. And a lot of us are hoping that one day, not only will this be adopted by organizations and nation states, but will take its place with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as one of the two founding documents of our covenants of our time. And I just have to say that I think every now and then our human species takes a step forward in its evolution, and I think the time is here for this. There's going to be great resistance, but it will have to happen if we and the earth are to survive. Thank you so much.
Last year, the 28th of July, we managed to pass, for the first time in the UN, a resolution that declared the human right to water. More than 60 years after the Human Rights Declaration, for the first time, we recognized that water is a human right. It was so evident because we already recognized that education was a human right. But water, until last year, was not recognized officially, formally, as a human right. This 28th of July, we're going to remember 1 year of the happy birthday of the human right to water. And in the UN, we are going to celebrate it with an event that's going to be called From the Human Right to Water to the Rights of Water. Because not only humans have rights, water has rights. And if we don't respect the rights of water, we humans are not going to have our human right to water. There are vital cycles in nature, and of course in water too. When we break those laws of nature, we break the system, and we are part of the system. So all this debate is in relation to, yesterday we said about three things. First, what is nature? Is it a thing? It's an object? It's a bunch of resources? Or it is a system? It's a community? The second question we must answer is, this system, this community, has laws, has rules, or not? And the third question is, if it has rules, and there are some natural laws, do states, do governments, does the society has to respect those laws, those rules, yes or no? And are we respecting those rules? This is the key question. From our point of view, we live in a system, the Earth system, we are just one part of it, and we, humans, and in particular, the capitalist system, doesn't respect the laws of nature. Not the vital cycle of water, of forests, of the atmosphere, nothing. So we are facing now a situation that all scientists in the UN, everybody agrees, we have broken the balance with nature. No government complains about this. But how we are going to restore that balance with nature? That is the key question. And we have two main proposals on the table. One is very strong, and it has a very nice name. It's called green economy. What they mean by green economy is to put value, monetary value, to nature, to the environmental services of nature, not only to the goods of nature, not only to the wood in the forest, but to the environmental service of the forest that captures CO2 and stocks CO2. They want to develop and to approve in a conference that's going to take place next year in Rio de Janeiro, that's going to be called Rio +20, a new bunch of market mechanisms in relation to nature, to the environmental services that have to do with forests, that have to do with biodiversity, that have to do with water. From their perspective, we are facing a critical situation because we didn't put price to these environmental services, nobody owns them, and because nobody owns them, nobody takes care of them. So we have to bring them into the market, and only if they're in the market, somebody will take care of them, and we will restore balance. This is not something hypothetical. You all have heard about the round of negotiation of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The second round is coming to an end, but there is going to be a third one. And already states are discussing that this third round of negotiation in WTO is going to be about the environmental services. So we're at the beginning of a new era of capitalism in relation to nature. From our point of view, if we want to reestablish that harmony with nature, we have to recognize those laws. And when we speak about rights of nature, we are speaking about to respect the right to exist, to reproduce itself, to its integrity, to its interrelationship. That is what's all about when it means rights of nature. You have to respect the rules, the laws that exist in this earth system if you want to live in it. Or otherwise, nature is going to react like it is reacting now. So, from our point of view, the critical thing is if you want to have rights of nature, you have to fight against capitalism. There is no way to begin a new kind of paradigm, a new kind of relationship with our system if we continue through this pathway that commodifies, that tries to make profit out of everything. including air, water, nature. The greatest challenge of humanity when we speak about rights of nature is, are we going to be able to transform this capitalist system? That's the key question. We think that the only possibility for humankind to survive is to develop another kind of system with another kind of relationship with nature. That is why it's crucial to work, to fight in this century for rights of nature. Thank you.
There are laws of capital accumulation, which I'm very interested in tracking. What do they look like? Well, the basic law of capital accumulation is of compound growth. And since around 1780, when systemic accumulation of capital took off, the growth has been at a compound rate of around 2.25% per year. Some decades, of course, it was zero. Last year it was zero, but China's going great guns at this moment, 10%. Now, 3% compound growth is a kind of minimum at which people in the financial press and everywhere else feel happy. And 3% compound growth when capitalism was constituted by what was going on in Manchester, Birmingham, and a few other hotspots in the world economy in 1780 is one thing. 3% compound growth on everything that's going on in the world right now is an astonishing prospect. So part of what I think we're running into is that in the history of capitalism is that we are at an inflection point in capitalism's history where that growth cannot be sustained. And what we see going on around us is an attempt over the last 20 or 30 years, in spite of there being an environmental movement that's probably been the most vigorous of all the social movements over the last 30 years, in spite of that, things have got markedly worse. I first came across the idea of the rights of nature when I read a piece by, Christopher Stone, about do trees have standing, and I was always impressed by William Douglas's dissenting opinion before the Supreme Court in 1972, in which he really kind of said, well, nature has rights, and he actually made a very interesting point. He said, people think this is a fictitious thing to do, to confer rights on nature, but that's what we do to corporations, and as Vandana said, they're fictions too. And they're very interesting fictions because when they want to, they declare they're no longer individuals and cannot be sued before, for example, this international court. You can't take them before the International Criminal Court, for example. They say, oh, we're not individuals as far as that is concerned. So you can create rights for an ecosystem if you want. Why can't we? If we can do it for corporations, why not? But this 3% compound growth forever is something that capital cannot stop doing for a very simple reason. Now, capitalists start the day with a certain amount of money. They go into the market and they buy labor power and means of production, and they go into production. They produce a commodity and then they sell it at the end of the day for more money than they started out with. In other words, capitalism has always been about more, and even more. And so what that means is that the capitalists themselves have no choice. They have no freedom of choice. They have to accumulate or die. The system has to grow or die. And it has got to the point where it's prepared not only for it to die, but for us to die and everybody else with it, if necessary. So here's this situation where if we're going to confront the problems that are facing us, you're going to have to start to look at the two things that capital does not ever want to take responsibility for. One is the environment. They treat it as the economists term it, an externality. It's got to be out there. Let somebody else bother with it. The other is the area of social reproduction. And actually what's so interesting right now about the Republican Party in this country is you see it wants to externalize those costs even more than they are now. Gut all the environmental regulation, get rid of OSHA, get rid of everything else. Now, I don't trust the state any more than the Tea Party does to do a lot of things, I have to say, because the state is corrupted by money power and corporate power, as we all know. But capital does not want to bear those costs for social reproduction or environmental. And one of the answers, to some degree, is to somehow come up with what you were saying earlier, you monetize the costs if you can, and then come up with a market solution. And, you know, this is amazing. I mean, how many times are we faced with this simple fact that what we rely on to get out of a mess is the very means by which we got into the mess? That is, we're told the answer to global poverty is more capital accumulation, when it's capital accumulation that produces global poverty. The way out of global environmental degradation is more spread the market in such a way that you can actually start to say you're internalizing some of the externalities, but actually you create a market which then becomes a huge vehicle for speculation. Carbon trading is a very, very nice market to hedge and derive and put CDOs and all kinds of things together around. And that was Al Gore's big negative for the environmental movement when he went to Kyoto, which was to say it has to be solved via the market. So here we are in this situation, and of course one of the things you can't talk about is to talk about what the alternative to capitalism is going to be. We have think tanks called universities. How many people in universities are clearly thinking about that? How many people in universities are totally corrupted into simply supporting the views of the corporations? You maybe saw Inside Job, you know, when the economist says, no, there's no conflict of interest between me teaching this stuff here and advising all the corporations on how to screw the world. No, not at all. So I think we've got to be clear a little bit about the politics and the vehicles and the means by which. I have a lot of, respect for the idea of, well, maybe you could, pass compacts and resolutions for the United Nations, where you could get a legal change here and there. But frankly, nothing's really going to be changed unless there's a mass social movement to stop it. It's only a mass social movement that's going to work. And what I think is fantastic about the Cochabamba Declaration was how many people were there and what they do when they go back home, which is not necessarily to give a seminar or something like that, but to actively organize. And this is a moment where there is a crisis, a deep crisis, both environmental and around questions of social reproduction. And there's relatively little new thinking at all about how to deal with that crisis at all in conventional circles. And I think one of the things we have to commit ourselves to, and one of the things that is, I think, very much embedded in this right to nature, is that alternatives have to be found, a new language has to be found, a new conceptual apparatus has to be set up, in which we can start to configure how we have an anti-capitalist movement and we construct an alternative to what capitalism is about. Otherwise, 3% compound growth forever for the next 100 years, just imagine what that would be like. Thanks. So I'd like now to suggest maybe some people here want to remark on what other people have said, and we'll have a little conversation on the panel. Vandana, you want to come in?
Well, the thing is, we agree so much with each
other.
Oh,
this is terrible, isn't it? That's boring. Well, let's find something to disagree about, okay?
What should we disagree about?
Maybe rather than disagree, maybe I could pick up on the point that you raised about global social movements, because I certainly I think things are getting to a really interesting point, and I actually feel a lot more positive in the last couple of years than I have before. And I think that what we're seeing is a situation where the structures of international governance are getting blocked and clogged up, and they, in many ways, they have problems because they're based primarily around the notion of the sovereign state, and we've got a lot more actors in the international arena now, NGOs, People's World Conferences on climate change and the rights of Mother Earth. But I remember reading Paul Hawken's book, Blessed Unrest, in which he talks about the fact that we have the largest social movement that's ever existed in the history of the planet. But he says it's not coherent, it doesn't have a common ideology. And I think that that's not quite right, because I think that, in fact, there is a common worldview, perhaps not an ideology. And I think that what we're seeing at the moment in the world is that we're at a point where we have to make an evolutionary leap, in a sense, and that starts off with shifting one's perspective. And I think that I sometimes liken it to the shift that happened when Galileo and Copernicus said, actually, the sun isn't moving around the earth is moving around the sun. Now, you can't hold both positions simultaneously. You've got to decide which camp you're in. And of course, it was resisted by the powers at the time, the Catholic Church, not because they were keen astronomers, but because it undermined their argument that human beings were the center of the universe, and the anthropocentric argument. And that, ironically, that is the same battle that we face today. Of course, in that situation, there's only one reality. I mean, the Earth just carries on going around the sun, regardless of what people think. And we're at the situation now. Does the universe revolve around us? In other words, is the Earth here simply as a larder or resources for us to use, and we external to the system and can carry on using it, exploiting us for it as long as possible? Or are we an integral part of the system, as Pablo Solon has been saying, in which case we have to, the route to human well-being is through contributing to the health and well-being of the whole, rather than exploiting and undermining it. Now, you've got to be in one camp or the other. And unless we make, as a society, unless we make that jump, I sometimes say to a new paradigm, but it's actually a very ancient paradigm as well, to recognize that we are part of the system, and then reshape our governance systems based on the recognition of that reality. Then I think we are not going to make the necessary changes, and we will either face face a precipitous decline in human populations, and possibly even become extinct in the longer sense. Just simply because, our species has flourished, because we have been able to adapt our environment in a way which makes it more likely for our offspring to survive. And we've pushed it so far that now we have changed and intervened in the environment so much that we're making it less likely for our offspring to survive. And in evolutionary terms, that always ends badly. So I think what's really interesting, to get back now to the social movement point, is we right now are beginning to see something very exciting happening. We're beginning to see, we've started a global alliance for the rights of Mother Earth, rights of nature, but the real point is that we, I think for the first time in a long time, have a common manifesto, if you like, which can unite all of these different movements, the social movements, social justice movements, indigenous peoples movements, the conservationists, the animal rights people, etc. And as a friend of mine once said to me, when we're looking for the common ground between us when we're arguing, and we know there have been lots of arguments in the social movements, we forget that the common ground is underneath our feet. It's the earth that's our common ground. And what we're proposing here is not some ideology. We're saying we must follow the rules that are established by the system. And that is the commonality that can bind a mass social movement together. And I think that's really exciting, because I think we're at the point where we could actually see all these diverse parts begin to cohere, like little streams flowing together to form a big river. It doesn't mean we're going to agree on everything, but it does mean that we are the people who think that the earth goes round the sun rather than the other way around.
I think I'll take on from the point that Cormac made, that we've been falsely made to believe that human well-being depends on the destruction of the earth and her resources. And the model of progress that has been sold, measured through growth, is that the more growth you have, the more well-being you have, and the less poverty you have. Now, India is such a good example of how this doesn't work. We have, I think they say that last year we actually even beat China on growth rates. But India today is the capital of hunger. We've got the largest number of malnourished children in the world, more than sub-Saharan Africa. And on the other hand, what we are finding is the more you follow nature's laws, the basic laws of nutrient recycling, the basic laws of water recycling, we actually are able to grow more food. And that's what we found in Navdanya, in our movement for seed saving and organic farming. And the United Nations has just submitted a report saying agroecology, which is working with nature, can double food production in the next 3 years. We don't need the GMOs, we don't need the toxic chemicals, we don't need any of the inputs that we are made to believe are absolutely essential to the growing of food. And I think we could run through every basic need. Water, the same thing. The more water you allow to run in the rivers, the more water you have for humanity. The more water you take out of the rivers, dam them up, or more water you mine from the aquifers, the less water you have for humanity. So in every sphere, we've basically been sold both economic systems and technological systems that impoverish human life because they impoverish nature. And part of the liberation that we have to create for ourselves is recognizing that taking less from nature and giving more to nature actually enables her to give more to us, whether it be food or water or air or whatever we need to be alive on this planet.
I thought it might be helpful to give some practical examples, and I'm hoping Shannon will explore a little bit with us the ordinances that you've been working on, very exciting specific examples of what can be done. And I just want to give one in the area of water, and that is the struggle around whether to put water on the market as a tradable commodity or not, and where that has happened. Chile, Australia, parts of this country, parts of my country now. It's just a terrible experiment. I just wanted to give you one quick example. In Australia, they have really one major water source, the Murray-Darling, and for many years now they have farmed really intensively the water from the Murray-Darling in great big cotton and rice and wine conglomerates. This isn't your ma and pa farmers. And they basically export the water of the Murray-Darling away. It's called virtual water. It's where you use water to grow or produce something, and if you export it away, you may as well be putting a pipe into the system. It isn't a piping water, but the water's going anyway. And if you see the graphs of where the Murray-Darling water has gone, it's been exported for the benefit of a fairly small group in Australia. Well, of course, the Murray-Darling started to die from the mouth up, as many of the rivers of the world are doing. So in 1993, the Conservative government of the time converted the water licenses of these big corporations, these big agribusiness companies, to water rights. And the idea was this, and this is what we're hearing and what Pablo was talking about. Well, you'll move to a more efficient use of this if we put a dollar figure on it. That was the argument, and it was led not by the government, but by some economists there, a guy named Mike Young, actually. Well, I've debated several times, and their argument was, well, everybody will use, the big companies, particularly the farmers, will use less water because the water they save they can sell, and that will be an incentive because they can make money. Of course, it worked just the opposite. What happened is that the big guys started buying up the small guys and eventually hoarding a great deal of water and owning it, and then they drove the price of water up. And the price of water went up in one decade in Australia from $2 a gigaliter to $2,400. It just skyrocketed. When the Labor government came in and realized that they were desperate for water to come back into the system, they tried to buy back the water of the Murray-Darling from these corporations that their previous government had basically just given to them. But they couldn't, because first of all, they don't have the guts to just say that's our water and we're going to take it back. But in any case, what they did was the companies just basically set the price, and the government hasn't been able to afford to buy it back. So now, as I predicted when I was first there years ago, and I've watched it come true, there are big investors moving in, some of them foreign. Macquarie Bank, which is their own bank, has set up an agribusiness arm, but a lot of foreign investors are coming in, these big hedge funds, and now they're buying up these water rights, and now they're telling Australian farmers what to grow. And so if Australian farmers, and it's a wealthy so-called first world country, are now growing, the big thing is now almonds and olives, or the new kind of in thing, using more water, shipping it away, and of course. So it's a very important story compared to, and I'll give you an example right here in the United States, the groundwater in Vermont was being mercilessly pumped because there was no protection, and 4 years ago, the government of Vermont brought in legislation that said that their water was a public trust. Now, they didn't use the language of the rights of nature, but they did in fact name that the water had to be preserved for the ecosystem, for all the people of Vermont, and for the future. And they've actually set up a licensing system where if you want to use more than a certain amount of water, you have to pay for the license, and the government has the right to say, if you're polluting or overusing or whatever, we're going to cut your license or cut it off altogether. In other words, these are two fundamentally different ways to look at what a common resource is, that looks at it in terms of the needs of the ecosystem. Oh, and they also will, in times of shortage, give preference to local sustainable food production over corporate-driven export ag use of water. So these are two I just wanted to be a little practical, because I think sometimes it helps to have these examples. They didn't use the term wild law, and they certainly didn't use the rights of nature, but the legislation there and in some other places around the world is really naming that we have to protect ecosystems, and in fact what they mean is that nature has rights, and this can have a very practical consequence in our lives.
Back to the idea of social movement, and how do we create social movements, as we talked about having. We're all in such agreement. We have these shared fundamental principles that when we talk about building a social movement to move forward on the rights of nature, or Pachamama, or any of the other words that are used around the world to really get to the heart of what we're talking about. But of course, democracy is messy. There is no one way to move forward, and certainly even if you tried, that wouldn't really be possible. But in terms of, so how do we get there? Sharing these fundamental principles and moving forward in different places, using the tools and the history and the understanding of a relationship with nature that you have in those places. It can look very different from place to place. I'd like to just give a little example of some of the work that's happening here in the United States, and some of the work that I do, as well as my partner, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And I'd like to just use the example of two very different places who've come together to do the same work and link arms in ways that they probably never could have foreseen. I work in, one of the places that I work in California is Mount Shasta, California, which is an iconic volcano, the highest mountain in the lower contiguous 48 states. And because California is a state prone to drought, certainly water bottlers and hydropower corporations, any corporation with an interest in the dwindling the dwindling water that lives, of course, in the mountains, like Mount Shasta, which is the home, the very sort of beginning of California's entire watershed system at the top there of California. And in Mount Shasta, they're faced with water bottling corporations coming in to essentially steal their water and ship it, of course, to other places for an enormous profit. And the other thing is, how many people have heard of cloud seeding? Okay, so good, wow, good. Okay, so cloud seeding, for those of you who do and don't know, is the process of injecting toxic chemicals into a passing storm cloud with the idea that you will condense the moisture and get it to rain more in a particular place. But of course, we trust natural weather cycles to provide rain wherever it's going to fall. So if you take water that is intended to move from one place to another and you direct it so that you can, as a corporation, capture it and own it in a particular place, not only are you causing all sorts of things like flash floods in the area of Mount Shasta, where they're one of the places where they're pitching this project, but also you're depriving other places of their natural rainfall. And Mother Nature actually learns, they've studied this, after a series of cloud seeding year after year, it stops raining in those places. So this idea that we can actually own nature and change nature is something that doesn't sit well with the residents of Mount Shasta for any reason at all. Nor does the idea of water withdrawal. In that place, I want to move off to another place, very different, the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was, of course, the home to global steel production. And it was called Hell with the Lid Off, was the name that it was dubbed, because you couldn't see, the sky was opaque from the steel production and the coal in the air, and sometimes the rivers would catch on fire. And that was the way life was in Pittsburgh until, of course, the big steel companies decided to leave. They'd really, taken everything from Pittsburgh that they wanted. And for 3 decades, 2 to 3 decades, the city of Pittsburgh decided to undergo a process, what they called the Renaissance, which was that encompassed social, changing like social, and environmental, and economic renaissance to rebuild the city into the kind of place that they wanted it to be, that they defined as the residents who lived there. And just about the time it was safe to drink the water again, fracking, you all know this. And the people of Pittsburgh said, no way. But the thing that Mount Shasta, this rural mountain community, and Pittsburgh have in common is that they weren't really fighting cloud seeding. They weren't fighting water withdrawal on one end. The common thread was that corporations were coming in over the consent. The laws are designed to give corporations rights which they used to wield over our communities and our environment, local ecosystems, like a club, to extract the wealth in those places. And so these two very different communities actually come together to do something really rather radical, which is to change the law. If the law says that corporations have rights and the community does not have the right to say no, if the law says that the local ecosystem is only there to create wealth for corporations to unlock it and take it, then the law is unjust, because laws were meant to protect and enshrine rights. Rights of communities, rights of people, and rights of ecosystems. And in both of these places, They have stood up to say, the law is wrong, so we're going to change it. We've done it in our past in the United States. Slavery was legal. Women didn't have rights. So these movements for rights actually change by people saying the rights are inherent. The rights of we as people are inherent. We're born with them. They're not given by the government. The government is there to support those. And the same extends to, if that's true for people, then it's true for life itself, for the environment. And in both of these places, they've passed, Mount Shasta is in the process of passing their law to say communities decide to say no to water withdrawal and no to cloud seeding, because asserting the community's right and the rights of nature to exist, flourish, and evolve. And that cannot happen as long as corporations are there to take it. So they've also stripped corporate rights in those cities, in those municipalities. And in Pittsburgh and in Mount Shasta, these two very different places suddenly have the same common issue, and they are moving in this social movement building way together in ways that we probably wouldn't have recognized. And they are one of a growing number of communities in the United States who are doing the very same thing, about 20 different communities already, and I get calls every day from more and more communities as corporate encroachment increases into the places where we live. People are willing to stand up and be Rosa Parks in a way and say, we're just going to actually do what's right. And we're not going to wait for the laws to catch up. We're going to change them. And this is just one way in the myriad ways that we're talking about building a social movement, to stand up and say, we're actually going to change our culture and we're going to change our laws to reflect what our culture should be.
I agree that the key thing is how to build a social movement that is capable to not only fight, but to win capitalism. That's the key thing. Now, how to build that social movement is the question. From our humble experience, social movements grow and develop when they come united and seek concrete goals and achieve victories. More than 10 years ago in Bolivia, we were in a situation where we were losing almost all the fights against the privatization. We focused on one specific fight that was against the privatization of water, precisely in Cochabamba. We unified the movement, not only urban movement, peasant movement, and we won. We managed to overthrow a transnational company that is Bechtel, you know, an American one. And once that happened, the social movement in Bolivia got enough strength to say now we have to go not only against the privatization of water, but against the privatization of one of the main resources in Bolivia, that is gas. More than 50 to 60% of our income comes from the export of gas. And if we wanted to have another future, we had to nationalize our gas, because otherwise, how we are going to be able to share the revenues of our country with the population. But it's not only necessary to have a movement that fights for specific goals. The movement had to fight for the government. Because if you don't fight for the government, then at the end, all victories that you achieve, you're going to lose them. So, we managed to build a movement that for the first time won an election with an indigenous president. And we were able to have our own government and to begin to develop our own strategies. We there found and developed also a different kind of paradigm in relation to capitalism. We don't speak very much about capitalism, we speak about living well versus living better. Capitalism is living better, always trying to have more and more. Well, we say we have to live well. That means in harmony not only between humans, but also with nature. We need some kind of growth, but this growth has to be only to satisfy basic needs. Because if we expect to have a permanent development, we are going to come in conflict with our Mother Earth. But the problem is that even if you achieve to be in a government in a nation like Bolivia, it's not possible to solve the key issues, the key rights of people and of Mother Earth, because the economy at this moment is globalized. It's not possible to have a good policy with Mother Earth inside Bolivia. It's not possible. Or we have this solved at the worldwide level, or it won't be solved. We were not going to be able to solve the main demands if there isn't a shift, a movement that goes beyond our borders, our continent, and that mainly comes to the key areas of capitalism, like the US, like Europe. So when we see on Mother Earth rights, we also see on what can unify us, no matter if we are in Africa, Asia, or Latin America, or here. What is the common thing? And a key thing is that we all live in one single planet. And we all depend on this Earth system. And no matter in which country we live, we face a common problem. Our governments, our states are not respecting the laws of nature. And this is one of the main causes of why we are in this situation. So to build a movement also requires to have a paradigm that really can open the way for a new way of thinking. And that is why, for us, it's not everything about rights of nature, but rights of nature is a key issue to build a real movement, a global movement, to change the world. Thank you.
My name is Vivian Demuth. I'm a Canadian writer and an environmentalist, and I wanted to mention, one of the things I learned from the American activists is about the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I wanted to mention their website, celdf.org, because they're doing rights of nature laws in Canada, in the U.S. right now, and I've been recommending them to my Canadian activist friends. And I've noticed on WBAI when they talk about fracking, the activists are talking about working within the regulatory system instead of doing the rights of nature work that CELDF is doing, and they're working on fracking issues. So Maude, I was wondering, as a Canadian, your rep said that the Council of Canadians is going to take on the rights of nature issues in Canada. I was just wondering if you have a time frame of when that we might start getting nature ordinances in Canada. Otherwise, I'll keep recommending SALDEF to my Canadian activist friends. And David, I was wondering if you could give us an update on the multi-party system. Having a multi-party system here in the U.S. In Canada, we have a left party. It seems to be a big problem here. And Shannon, I was wondering if SALDEF had thought about including alternative economic models in their organizing.
Okay, thank you. We take one question from over here.
The question is maybe playing the role of devil's advocate that nobody managed to do so far in the panel, which is if the language of rights is really, I guess what are the foreseeable problems of using a language of rights in terms of the rights of nature? Because, you know, as some of you already alluded to, when you have the disproportionate force of corporations which use the language of legal language to create barriers and justify all their criminal activities, I mean, how do we imagine that a language of rights will be the solution in a way to organize ourselves around it? I mean, I see the dilemma, but I wonder if some of you have thought through some of the challenges, and maybe it would be helpful for everybody to listen and think about those as well.
Okay, let's go over here.
My name's Aviva Ramani. I'm an ecological artist, and I want to thank you all for your presentations. It was very inspiring. My question is about social networking. It seems that in order to really launch this kind of movement, we don't have time to just connect many small groups here and there. It has to be an Egyptization of the world in response. And so I want to know what kinds of strategies are either already being implemented or do you foresee being implemented with social networking?
Okay, let me turn it over to the panel very briefly. Who wants to take up? You want to take up the legal question, rights question, or anybody?
Just on the question of rights, to be frank, I'm not sure that rights is the best way in which human beings could regulate their affairs. I mean, using the term of rights tends to set up a conflictual relationship, and it may have been better to have started with the idea of interests, where each group has different interests and one tries to maximize all the interests being met. But we are faced with a situation where our legal systems are based on rights, and particularly human rights. And if we use a different word for nature, we will inevitably use something less powerful. If we say that humans have got rights but nature's only got interests, human rights will continue to dominate. So I think for practical purposes, it's important to use the language of rights in relation to other than human beings if we're going to use it for human beings. And the legal systems are based on rights, on enforcing rights, etc. So unless we're in a position where we could scrap the whole system and start from scratch, which I don't think is practical, then the best way of transmuting the existing systems is by widening the class of rights holders so that we can use the machinery of the state to balance not only human rights against each other, but also the rights of the whole Earth community against human rights. So I think it's a practical question, but of course one of the difficulties is that the word rights is very laden with historical meanings, and so it sounds very strange to apply to other than humans.
Wouldn't it be useful, though, to emphasize that you're thinking about other patterns of rights other than individual rights, that common property rights, for example, are crucial in this arena?
No, we're trying to get away from property rights. So what we're saying is that it's not a question. I mean, as indigenous people say, we belong to the earth, not the other way around. So we prefer to emphasize that it's a question of relationships. And of course, some of those relationships, as you say, are maybe between a community of people and a particular piece of land over a very long period of time. We would call that common property rights from our current perspective. But I think that the key thing is to to recognize that the ecosystems and the universe are held together by relationships. That's the glue that holds everything together. And the more, as with human beings, the more intimate those relationships, if you like, the healthier the system. And what we're trying to do is establish governance systems which promote intimacy in the sense of close connection, mutual benefit, not only between human beings, but between humans and the land, etc. So certainly I agree with you in the sense of moving away from a notion of a relationship only between an individual and land or something, to a recognition that this is a web of relationships, and that we need to promote the strength and intimacy and mutual benefit of those relationships rather than undermine them.
Maude, do you want to reassure people when it's all going to come to Canada?
As soon as we can.
You want to?
Just to answer very quickly, and I work at Global Exchange and I partner with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. So in the United States, there are more than one group working together on this work. In terms of alternative economic models, those are being developed by communities. So in Maine and California and the state of Washington, we see communities organizing to say, we want a Bill of Rights of sustainability. We want to include, rights for the land and for food and farming and workers' rights and all of these things. So these alternative economic models are, the very first ordinances were really based on what we're against. We don't want fracking, we don't want this. And the second wave is really about creating the kinds of places that we do want in harmony with nature. So those are happening. And also just to say in terms of, how fast can we build this, 2006, just in terms of like the legal work, which isn't to ignore all of the other social movement work that's happening around this idea of rights of nature, but we had the very first law in the United States passed in Tamaulipas, Pennsylvania in 2006. In 2008, we saw Ecuador introduce it into their constitution, and now we have 20, in just the US, 20 communities passing these laws, and now we're having this discussion at the United Nations. Is it fast enough? We don't know, but it's moving at the pace, it's gathering steam all along, which is how social movements work.
Anyone want to address the question of how we all become like Egypt?
I think when you try and shortcut and bypass hard organizing work, the victories disappear as fast as you got them. And you just have to look at what happened to Egypt immediately after Tahrir Square. How the women weren't even allowed to celebrate International Women's Day. How the fundamentalists have started to take over very fast. And I can tell you this even for, on the 1st of April, one of my dear colleagues, a wonderful man who built up a village and has become quite a figurehead for anti-corruption. And he sat on a fast and wanting a new law, anti-corruption law. And this thing was all done on SMS and email. 4 million people got involved. But because the hard work wasn't done, when the attacks started to come from the corporate lobbies and others who didn't want this anti-graft law, the thing started to fall apart. And it's happening right now. So I don't think there's you can't bypass people's democracy. Not with the most efficient communication system.
Let's go to a question over here.
So not to dwell on the past, but to look at it, I've written my question down. 40 years ago, 2 books appeared on the scene by a couple called the Meadows and by the Ehrlichs. Initially, it was accepted by the public, and then the backlash became frenetic and completely overwhelmed the situation. I'd kind of like to know the panel's viewpoint, whether they were being unfairly treated or whether we should have really listened to what was contained in those 2 books. And if I need to say the book titles, it's The Limits to Growth and The Population Bomb.
Yeah, it's all about
Okay, over here.
Hi, thank you for the panel today. It's a question for the whole panel. If there's some thoughts or response to the lecture that was given here recently by Slavoj Žižek, who also gave a conference in Bolivia where he affirmed that, commenting on President Morales' argument that capitalism has destroyed Mother Nature or Pachamama, and Slavoj Žižek said that if that's true, that's the only good thing that has come from capitalism, which he actually repeated here. And his view about nature, and also Timothy Morton's and other people's view of queer ecology and nature.
Okay, vamos over here.
Hi, Nancy Romer, a Brooklyn Food Coalition in Brooklyn College. I'd like you to talk a little bit about the movement around food, the right to food and to food sovereignty, particularly the leadership of the Global South, and how those of us in the Global North can connect to that movement and be part of it.
Okay, who wants to take up the question of what to make of the Meadows and Ehrlich?
I'll take up the
You take the lot.
and this one too.
Oh, take this one. Okay.
Yeah. I think the whole issue of limits to growth was trivialized, not because there are no limits, but because commodity prices fell. Now, it isn't the case that today when commodity prices rise, that they're suddenly saying, let's conserve, which would be the actually reasonable response. And as far as the Ehrlichs go, I think all the ecological arguments I totally support. But the panic about the population bomb, first of all, I mean, the word of population bomb is so wrong because it makes it look like women's wombs are ticking away and going to explode. And you've got to... And it's true, you know. What else? What else is the bomb?
I hope the TSA doesn't get you.
Red, yeah? The color red. And I think the relationship between humans and the earth and her carrying capacity is so complex. I sometimes joke and say that, you know, the real population problem is the fact that Italy, which is governed by the Vatican, has such a severe population decline that they're not even reproducing themselves. 70% people are above the age of 60. And that's in spite of the Pope. So it's, you know, too many layers of why people have more children and why they have less, but the point is the resource and consumption question with population. It's so clear. I mean, you do industrial agriculture, and maybe this is where I move to the food sovereignty argument. Industrial agriculture is the most wasteful system you could ever have. Yes. And the more you expand it, the more hunger you create, because you're taking land that could produce 2, 3, 5 times the food, and making it then not just grow food as commodity, but once it becomes a commodity, it becomes biofuel to run cars or cattle feed, and there's no food. Yeah? If you do the figures for the United States, 60% cattle feed, 30% biofuel, where's the food? And anyway, it's GMO, and that's not food. 10 units of energy put in to produce 1 unit of energy in kilocalories in terms of food. And now the new data that's coming out that in industrial systems, 50% of the food is being wasted. And they come to us in India and say, you must industrialize to reduce waste. I always say, but there's no waste in India, because what you don't eat, the cow does. Yeah. Every bit of cabbage that went a little overripe, or fruit that went overripe, and then ultimately there's the earthworm and the compost. There's no waste. In nature, there's no waste. There's only recycling. And the more you work in decentralized systems, closed loops, the more food you produce because you're not wasting anything. Now, food sovereignty is basically the ability of people, communities, individuals, societies to be able to provide food for themselves. And I think this has become vital. It's become vital because the way the system is going, we won't get food. We'll get stuff that's not edible. It'll be non-food. And we can see the consequences of living on a diet of non-food all around us. The second reason why it's so important to have food sovereignty and food democracy and the food justice movement is because, in my view, like Pablo Solon talked about the fact that the rights of nature is the cutting edge for defending the rights of people and creating another social and political and economic order. And within that, I really do believe the food justice movement is the cutting edge, because everyone has to eat every day. And once we all decide we are not going to be force-fed GMOs, we are not going to be force-fed toxics, we're going to work with farmers in partnership so that there can be more organic farmers providing. And once we start to change the relationship from corporate agribusiness dictating our food system to people democratically shaping it, you have no waste, you conserve biodiversity, you have more people involved in creative work. I don't think there's any work more creative than organic farming and producing food. How boring it is to sit at Wall Street and just look at figures moving up and down. I mean, torture, if you ask me. You take away the salary, no one will do it. But farmers grow food without a salary.
Pablo, do you have any response to the Zizek question on... Anybody here got any response to...
We didn't follow the question.
Well, the Zizek question is that the rhetoric of Mother Nature is kind of almost, it's so pre-modern, and it's a backward-looking vision so he doesn't like that kind of manner of talking.
That one I'd like to say something.
Yes, okay, all right. I didn't say it myself, I'm just saying what Zizek said.
Is Zizek this philosopher?
Yes.
He's called the Elvis Presley of philosophy, I'm told.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Well, I think he's just got it totally wrong, because if you ask me, relating to the rights of Mother Earth is a post-industrial idea.
Okay. All right, let's get some more questions then. We'll go over here first.
Hi. My name is Poonam Srivastava. I'm a writer. And, way back when I was a kid, my dad had that book, Food for People, Not for Profit, and Small is Beautiful by E.M. Schumacher and all those people. And this thing has been going on forever. I'm going to be 50 next week, and I've watched, I've watched this movement, and we have technology now that we didn't have before, and that's what's new. And somebody was saying, like the sun goes around the moon, or the sun goes around the planet, or does, you know what I'm saying? So what I'm saying is, if we want to get really, really radical and really talk about systems and how this thing is going to grow, I think it's not necessary to talk about speed. And what I want to ask you, because I could go on and I'm going to try not to, is that, is there some way to encourage a decentralized growth? Because that's how I see the world growing now. Like the brain we're getting away from this idea of centers of language and centers of whatever to decentralization. So all of the people who are political, and I'm political, like this whole idea of using the big words like capitalism or et cetera. Democracy, what does it mean? I've lived in a democracy supposedly most of my life. So, I mean, and language is really important. I personally like public trust over rights, but I'll live with rights. So decentralization, that's kind of my question.
Okay, all right, let's go over here.
Thank you. I heard this quote a couple of weeks ago. If the captain says the ship is sinking, would you call him a pessimist? So my question to you is, how do you get and keep people's attention on really hard subjects and keep them participating over the long term till the solution arrives or is brought to be?
Okay.
I'm Karsten Struhl. I teach philosophy at the New School and John Jay College. And first, let me just say this is a fantastic panel. I really thank you for being here.
Thank you.
I have a brief comment, not a manifesto, and then a question. My comment is this, that the overthrow of global capitalism is a necessary but clearly not sufficient condition of doing what we need to do. We need not only a new paradigm of understanding humanity in general to nature, but we need a new paradigm of socialism, one which recognizes socialism as not simply human-centered, but is also understanding the needs and intrinsic values of other species. And without that kind of socialism, we cannot succeed in doing what we want to do. So that's my comment. My question is to push you a little bit on the idea of the rights of nature and the rights of ecosystems, including water. It makes sense to me that species have rights, they're living things. It makes sense to me that all sentient beings have rights. I'm wondering whether when we talk about the rights of ecosystems or something like water, that isn't a shorthand for simply saying these are the habitats which are necessary to preserve the rights of all species. In other words, I'm asking whether you want to say that water as such has an intrinsic value, or does it have a value because it is the habitat in which beings who have an intrinsic value live?
Thank you. Let's have one more question over here.
One more question over here?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll,
thank you all very much for coming. It was a very interesting presentation. My primary interest in terms of this rights of nature issue is the mechanism by which these rights are to be protected. In America, there is a traditional regulatory agency model for this protection, and the agency that I think of as the most close analogy would be the EPA. Now, this analogy worries me for a number of reasons, because the EPA has proven itself vulnerable to corruption not only at the local level in places like West Virginia, but at the national level as well. In the long term, the processes that lead to accumulation of capital and lead to the interests that distort these agencies, that is certainly something that I would like to see addressed, I'll put it that way. But in the short term, in practical terms, do you see either alternatives to this model or means of refining or perfecting this model with respect to the rights of nature?
Okay, who wants to have a crack at some of these questions?
Take the one on water.
Well, the first thing is that when we speak about rights of Mother Earth, rights of nature, we're not speaking about the rights only of the living beings of nature. We're speaking about the rights of all the beings, all the components of the Earth system. That means the rights of the glaciers. That means the rights of the rivers, the rights of forests. It's, from our point of view, all these are parts of one system. The earth is a living system. And when we, as a whole, it's not that only, those that have some kind of animal life or plant life, we can call they have life, the rest not. No. The system as a whole has life. And you know that the scientists say that now. They recognize. And in the UN, in the debate, they told us, but that's a religion, that's a belief, that's not true, that's Pachamama, that's from the Andean region. And we came with quotes from the NASA. Because the NASA recognizes that the earth as a system is a living system. And when we speak about the rights, we are speaking about the rights of the whole and all its components. And of course, water has rights. The cycle of water is something vital for water, but for the whole system. We can break it. We are breaking it. We are going to affect the system. So we have to respect all these rights, all these laws, all these rules that the system as a whole and all its components have, including humans. Now, coming to the question of why rights, when we began this discussion 2 years ago in the UN, they said, don't speak about rights, just like some of you. Call it principles for a responsible way of living with nature, and that can be okay. And precisely, the key question is to call it rights. Why they didn't want to call it rights? Because principles are principles. Right, you can be sued. That's the difference. And if a corporation violates the rights of a river, of an ocean, of a glacier, and can be sued, then they are in trouble. Because when we're speaking about rights, it's not that EPA or a minister or the government. No. It means that all citizens would be able to stand up and can defend the rights of nature when they are affected. That is the key thing. I would agree that in theory, I would like not to have any legal right system. That is an invention. But at this moment, to confront that system of only corporate rights that are in front of human rights, to speak about Mother Earth rights, is really something that challenges the whole legal system on which this capitalist society is based. That is why we insist on calling it rights of nature, rights of Mother Earth, rights of Earth system, but we are speaking about rights. Because somebody that violates a human right, kills another, violates the right of life, he goes to jail. But if you violate the right of a river and that river disappears, nothing happens to you. That's not possible. What we do, we have to be accountable, because the key issue in order to bring balance to the system is that no matter what we do in relation to humans or to other components of the system, we all have to be accountable of what we do in relation to our Earth system.
Okay. Anybody want to respond to? Yes, Maude?
Well, just very briefly, I would touch on two things. One was the question about decentralization, and I think that we might have to make a distinction between local control of local systems and the decentralization of local peoples, or the rights of local peoples. But we don't want to abdicate the responsibility of governments to provide the law and the protection and the finances. I mean, I know a lot of us are living in communities where the federal government has just downloaded responsibility to the state or the province. It's downloaded the responsibility to the next level of municipalities without any money. And we're finding a lot of our municipalities totally strapped for funding and having to turn to the private sector to run water systems and build roads and sewers and so on. That form of decentralization is a form of handing off power to corporations, and I think we need to be really, really, really careful with our language there. The other, I just wanted to talk, somebody asked about how do you get and keep the attention of movements and people. It's hard work, of course, but I think one of the themes that we're working on is this notion of, this ancient notion of the commons, and the right for every single person to care, to have a voice, to have a place. I have a colleague who coined a phrase, the right not to know, which I think is a brilliant phrase, and that's to those who have privilege, and they just simply don't have to know, because they don't. They just have the right to walk through life with privilege. I think it's a lovely phrase, and so I tried to counter what would be the counter phrase, and it isn't quite the right to know, it's the right to care. And you don't have to necessarily be a scientist or have a senior position in a big environmental movement or whatever to say, you know, we care. I mean, we've got a big fight around the Great Lakes. A private nuclear facility on the Canadian side wants to ship 16 bus-sized radioactive spent nuclear rods in ships down the Lake Huron, up Erie, up this through Lake Ontario, the St. Lawrence, and across the ocean to be recycled in Sweden. And we're building a movement of just ordinary people, First Nations people, local communities who are, you know, from the Lord of the Rings, you know, you shall not pass. We're just going to say, you can't pass here. You shouldn't have been here in the first place. Just finished writing a report called Our Great Lakes Commons, A People's Plan to Protect the Great Lakes Forever. And the theme of this is that we need to call, and I think we need to do this with all our water systems, all our ecosystems, that this is a commons, a public trust, and a protected bioregion which recognizes the rights of nature and recognizes the living reality of the Great Lakes. And every single person, 45 million of us who live on or near and have our livelihood there, have a right to have a say, and we should not be leaving it to the so-called experts. And this notion of having this right to care, I think, is really important. You see people all the time who say, I so agree with you, what can I do? There's this feeling of helplessness. And I think that's what's so rich and exciting about the ordinances, or this notion of a commons, and everyone having the, not only the right, but the responsibility to say, you know, you can't go here. We will stop those nuclear reactors. I'm absolutely convinced of it, because it's just too outrageous, and the people will speak.
Okay. What?
Sorry, really quickly, just to address the question about the regulatory system. Interesting historical fact that the regulatory system was actually, the very first regulatory law was written at the behest of the railroad corporations, at least in the United States. It's a fallacy and a neat trick that, that corporations have us believe that they're the ones being regulated, when in fact the regulatory system is about regulating the input that citizens have. Regulatory law means that we can destroy the environment. It automatically says these activities. We can blow the tops off of mountains, we can seed clouds, we can frack gas. Those are legal activities. And so who's really being regulated? The regulatory system says how much harm can we do in order to make this corporate profit. And so when we're talking about rights of nature and we're talking about the regulatory system, I mean, the communities that have been passing these laws have turned their backs entirely on the regulatory system because it won't stop the harm coming to their communities.
We're going to be running out of time here very soon, so I'm going to take 3 questions from over there and 3 questions from over here, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close it down. So just can we have 3 and 3? Start over here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's absolutely great to watch you all sharing with and supporting each other rather than contesting and competing with each other. I think that's exemplary to what we have to learn to do. And it's nice to be able to ask a question in the same spirit. And I'll say my question briefly, but I have to say a little bit after it. The question briefly is, what do you think the role of indigenous thought or the actual presence of indigenous people in the big countries and big, powerful, industrial, capitalist countries in the world have to teach us? You've all been saying it already, but have to participate in building the future with us, and their ideas, their presence and their ideas. And I guess I want to make 2 points. One is that in my perception, the oldest African principle is something that's active in the streets of New York today and in this room. What goes around comes around. What goes around comes around. We've been hearing it from the panel, right, under different names. I think that it's part of it. And another one is the Lakota have the word Mitakuyasin. I don't know if people are familiar with that. Every one of the native languages has a word like this. The best English translation, I'm told, is something like all my relations. The sense that for me to be anything, I have to be in relation with, and that doesn't only mean physical things, that means all my relations. And I could go on to the distinction between the world and the earth. I think that we need to think about too, because the world is in the mind and the earth is here. You mentioned that. So I wonder how how those things bear. I wonder how those things bear on the challenges we face. Yeah, in your views.
Thank you. Let's go over here.
My name is Doris. I would like to share a movement I'm working on that I'm very excited about, and perhaps...
I hope you can do it briefly because
Yes.
we don't have that much time.
We are working on a movement. It's a letter campaign. We are requesting the implementation and acceptance of the rights of Mother Earth from all nations, and we are going to deliver letters written by people from around the world to the Earth Summit next year in Rio. If you would like to participate, it would be a possibility for each one of you in this room to make a difference, and it would surely make a big difference to the whole movement. You can download a letter template on our webpage. It's rightsofmotherearth.com.
Okay, thank you. Let's go here.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I think this feeds into the question that just came before me on this side. I'd like to just hear anybody's thoughts on the role of spirituality in terms of initiating or furthering the paradigm shift that we all see as necessary in building that broad social movement. Spirituality being understood as the sense of connectedness, and I think that quick second, grab some notes. Vandana, you talked about there's a disconnection, and that's typically, is considered a sort of a spiritual ailment for people to feel disconnected. And I think we should look at King and King's admonition, or that love and power should not be considered opposites, but that love is implementing the demands of justice, and justice is correcting that which stands against love. And also, just as activists, we need to cultivate a radical sort of forgiveness to people who are not yet sort of in the loop, and be forgiving of ourselves as well, because we're all doing the best we can. Thank you.
Yeah.
But please comment on the role of spirituality. Thank you.
Well, yeah.
Hi, my name is Maya. This has been a wonderful evening, thank you. But I'm going to try to make my question as concise as possible. Another gentleman was talking about the EPA and the lack of enforcement. That I feel like there already are rules and laws in place that are supposed to protect the environment. And, in the United Nations, too, I saw this documentary called American Outrage about a lawsuit that the Dan sisters in, I believe it was Nevada, brought against the federal government of the United States, and the UN ruled in favor of them. They said, you're right, your rights have been violated, and there was zero consequence, like nothing happened as a result of the UN ruling in favor of these sisters whose, you know, a land that had been ancestrally shared with the government and this native group was being used for mining, their animals were being killed, and there was just no enforcement. So I just feel like, you know, if you put more pretty laws on the books, if they're not enforced, like, what does it do?
Okay, thank you. Let's go here.
Hi, my name is Elsa Little, and I'm a student at Global College. It's such an honor to be here, and I feel so privileged to have the opportunity to ask you a question. I just finished writing my thesis about ecofeminism as an ideal approach to community development, focusing on the inspirational Wangari Maathai and the Green Belt movement. And I was just hoping that you could speak a little bit about the role of women, and particularly women empowerment, in achieving this wild loss.
Okay, we have two or more people left, so why don't we get those and maybe wrap it up.
Imana jatugi kuna alechkanchi kikinkunata yupaichani kaiman shamushkamanta yukanchipag alpamamanta parlangapag. Thank you very much. Good evening to all of you. My name is Nicholas. I'm just a common citizen of the earth, and I'm no one. I would like to make a little bit of comment. It was a lot of people raising the issues that as indigenous people, what we are doing in order to complement or in order to stop this killing of the Mother Earth. I have to say it's very simply, as indigenous, since we were born, we live together. And every day, every morning, 24 hours, we are in contact with the Mother Earth, and we talk each other, we live each other. So, and I would like to say also that this concept of the rights of the nature is not new. As indigenous, we have lived for thousands of years, and we practice every day. And there is an issue to say in our villages, if you write a book or put in something, how can you do that? How can you put the Mother Earth's way of thinking in the writing? Obviously, I'm not against the intellectuality, against the writers, but I think what we need to do is live with the Mother Nature, appreciate. And I think one of the ways to do here, perhaps in the United States, is perhaps to teach to the children, rather than just making laws. Now, in Ecuador, somebody said, it's great in Ecuador, it seems like most of the people said Ecuadorian president is the great one, but it is, I have to say, as an indigenous and as Ecuadorian, I hope I am still Ecuadorian, because I was kicked out too. And also from the United Nations, I was also expelled from the Permanent Forum because we talk the truth, we say the truth, and we try to practice the truth. And in Ecuador, yes, this concept is called summa causa, the good living, the wellness. But in the reality, I have to say, with all due respect to the people, might be sympathizers, it's the president is educated in the United States, but it is not complying what he said. It is in the Constitution, the rights of the nature, but it is a concept, it's a simple words. And now he wants to drill in the Amazon, the oil. He is suing like 189 activists are being sued as a sabotage and as a terrorism. So one president cannot be that way. But I just wanted to share those things. In other United Nations, it's great. We have an institution. But I don't see people looking down, with exceptions of certain very spiritual, physical, in loving people to the earth, to the people. But it isn't. So we would like to say is, as indigenous, in my opinion, besides creating laws, I think we need to do is also, maybe you can help us, we need to create our own United Indigenous Nations, but not with that to make papers, not to be writing, not to be sitting there, but to go to work, to defend the water, the trees, because they are spiritual livings, they have a physical livings, they have a feelings.
Yeah, we have to.
So I understand that we are running out of time, but yes, this is another thing that in the indigenous world, we have a time and I appreciate to you that this is not like a running. You know, we have to. It is, we have to go home. Yes, I have to go get home. We have to live with the rules, but I just wanted to say that we must be patient. If we don't love ourselves, and if we don't love the earth, what good does to make a laws? In Ecuador, there's more than 40,000 laws. So, my question to you is very simple. As indigenous, we are like more than 390 million around the world. And as indigenous people and peasants, we hold the land. We live together. Do you agree if we will take power and we control our land as we have been controlling, and say to the corporations, you don't stick your dirty feet and you're hungry for money? Do you agree with that? Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, this has been a wonderful evening, but I'm sorry to sort of maybe bring a sour note, and which is sort of bringing us back to the pitfalls of using the language of rights. That's something that we've been sort of talking about. And then I just want to say that we have seen this language of rights, and especially of natural rights, used before, right? And especially like, the New World was conquered because on the justification that it violated the natural law of free commerce in 500 years ago. So I'm just thinking about how maybe this, if we're talking about another language of law and natural rights, and whether that could be used for some sort of imperialist purposes, some sort of imperialist projects. And I'm thinking in our question here, we're thinking of nature versus corporations, but how does this sort of nature versus human being, some poor guy who is poaching on the edges of the forest, I mean, how does those sort of problem may arise or may be solved in this framework of law and rights?
Okay, thank you. You have a smorgasbord of questions if you want to respond to just briefly to any of them you want to take up.
Just to start initially on the question of indigenous people's perspectives, I'm certainly very conscious of the fact that many of the ideas we're talking about are very ancient ideas, and when writing Wild Law, I tried to convey this by really putting quotes almost throughout the book from indigenous peoples throughout the world, illustrating how what I was saying was consistent with the wisdom which has come out of almost, as far as I can see, every culture on the planet that I've come across. So certainly I think that there is a great recognition among all of us that we need to learn from these cultures, what Vandana's written a book called Monocultures of the Mind. Our monoculture of industrial society is in big trouble, and what you do then is you go back to the wild and you find the genes, the important genes, and those genes are in the indigenous people's cultures. They're the genes of some of the answers, the new dream are to be found there. So I think we're certainly very conscious of that, and conscious of the need to learn from those cultures and be inspired by them. Also, on the question of spirituality, I mean, I agree completely that spirituality is very much part of what we're doing, and we use the word sacred often, and sacred is something which I think denotes something of great value which lies beyond the commercial. People often mistake it and say you're being religious. That's not the purpose. But just then to deal very briefly with the question of why we're trying to have more laws, and haven't we already got environmental laws? The important thing to appreciate here is that we're not proposing more environmental laws. We're saying exactly that they are not working, because environmental laws, as Shannon has mentioned, are already designed to regulate the rate at which we exploit. In other words, it's a bit like in the days of slavery, passing a law that says you may only whip your slave a maximum of twice a day instead of as often as you like. But the real issue is the question of slavery. Why are you treating a person as a slave in the first place? And the That's what we're trying to get at. You know, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was a non-binding instrument, but it changed norms in the world, and it led to binding instruments. And that's what we're trying to say. We're trying to say that we need to use this language of rights precisely because it jars, because it forces us to look at nature as a subject in a different way. And you know, I think that, well, we've talked about, I think, why we think it's necessary to use this terminology, but certainly I think one of the most important things is not, if we're going to use the terminology of human rights, then we have to use the same term for the rest of creation. And when we're talking about the rights, we're talking about the rights to be and to play your role in the system. And that is something which is as important for a mountain or a river as it is for an animal. Each of us have our role to play within the system, and the whole is not complete and is not fully functional unless each plays its role. And so what we're doing really is we're trying to map our systems, our human government systems, onto natural systems so that they're consistent. So whether you're talking about socialism or capitalism or whatever, these are things we've made up. And what we need to do is we need to assess them and say, to what extent are they consistent with the reality of the earth laws? And to the extent that they're not consistent, regardless of what ideology they are, we need to change them.
Anybody else want to?
Well, very briefly on the question that was raised on the issue of ecofeminism. First, I'd like to say the South End Press has brought out a 20th year edition, and the longer arguments and analysis is there. But I think just as feminism is about the recognition, respecting, appreciating women as subjects, as independent, autonomous, sovereign subjects, ecofeminism enlarges that circle for all life on Earth.
Pablo? Any final thoughts from anybody? If not, I'll just want to thank the panel. It's been a great privilege to have you here and a wonderful evening. Thank you.